not only about impressment, causes of the War of 1812. A second war for independence? By 1812, the United States was barely 3 decades old, a young republic still finding its place in a world dominated by empires. To many, it seemed that America's great struggle for independence had already been won in 1783. But history was not done testing this fragile nation. In the shadows of the Atlantic, in the smoke of European wars, and in the ambitions of frontier settlers, another storm was forming, one that would push America once more into battle with Great Britain. The War of 1812 is often remembered for one word: impressment, the British practice of seizing American sailors and forcing them into naval service. But the war was not only about impressment. It was about honor, trade, territory, and the future direction of the United States itself. This is the full story of why America declared war, and what those causes reveal about a nation still defining what independence truly meant. The world in flames, Europe's wars, America's peril. The dawn of the 19th century found the world ablaze. Across the Atlantic, Europe was locked in chaos. Empires rose and fell, and one man's ambition threatened to reshape the entire world. That man was Napoleon Bonaparte. His armies thundered across Europe, conquering nations and challenging the ancient power of Great Britain. The result was not merely another European war, but a global conflict fought on land, at sea, and across every ocean. From 1803 onward, France and Britain waged a struggle that reached far beyond Europe. It spread to the Caribbean, Africa, Asia, and inevitably to the coasts of North America. Every harbor, every merchant ship, and every neutral port became a pawn in this struggle between two empires. The United States, still young and fragile, stood far from the battlefields of Europe, but it could not remain untouched. Though the new republic had no desire to take sides, its prosperity depended on trade with both Britain and France. American ships carried grain, timber, tobacco, and cotton to ports around the world. Commerce was the foundation of its economy and the symbol of its independence. President Thomas Jefferson believed that America could remain neutral, trading peacefully with all nations while avoiding war. He hoped the republic could stand apart from Europe's endless rivalries, a nation of farmers and merchants, not kings and conquerors. Yet neutrality in a world consumed by war proved to be an illusion. Britain, determined to crush Napoleon's empire, ruled the seas with the most powerful navy in history. To choke off France, it issued the Orders in Council, decrees that prohibited neutral nations from trading with French-controlled ports unless they first stopped in Britain, paid fees, and obtained permission. Napoleon retaliated with his own continental system, declaring that any ship obeying British orders would be treated as an enemy and seized by French forces. The United States was caught in the middle. American merchants who wanted only to conduct honest trade found their ships stopped, their cargoes confiscated, and their crews mistreated by both powers. Britain and France had turned the oceans into a battlefield, and American commerce was the casualty. President Jefferson tried to defend neutrality through diplomacy, but neither London nor Paris would yield. The thunder of cannon and the clash of empire drowned out the protests of a small republic across the sea. As the crisis deepened, the illusion of neutrality shattered. By 1806, British warships patrolled the American coastline, stopping and searching vessels under the US flag. They claimed the right to seize British subjects who had deserted from the Royal Navy, but in practice, they captured anyone they chose, including thousands of American citizens. This practice, called impressment, outraged the nation. Each sailor dragged from his ship was a symbol of violated sovereignty. Then, in 1807, came the Chesapeake Leopard affair. The American frigate USS Chesapeake was stopped off the coast of Virginia by the British warship HMS Leopard. When the Chesapeake's captain refused to allow a search for supposed deserters, the Leopard opened fire, killing and wounding American sailors before dragging men away in chains. The attack in American waters provoked national fury. Many called for war. But Jefferson, unwilling to risk open conflict with the greatest naval power on earth, chose an economic weapon instead. he signed the Embargo Act of 1807, halting all American exports to foreign nations. His hope was to punish Britain and France by depriving them of American goods. The result was disastrous. The embargo devastated the American economy. Merchants went bankrupt, ships lay idle in harbors, and dock workers lost their jobs. Smuggling became rampant as citizens defied their own government to survive. Instead of forcing Britain and France to respect US rights, the policy punished Americans themselves. By the time Jefferson left office in 1809, the nation was weary and divided. His successor, James Madison, inherited an angry and frustrated country. Madison believed in peace, but he faced a reality in which peace no longer seemed possible. The old hope that neutrality could protect the Republic had vanished. The United States had tried diplomacy, persuasion, and economic pressure. None had worked. American ships were still being stopped. American sailors were still being seized, and American trade was still strangled by European decrees. As war consumed Europe, it cast its long shadow across the Atlantic. The world was in flames, and the young American Republic found itself standing in the smoke. The nation that had once declared independence from Britain now faced the possibility of fighting its former ruler once again. The United States did not seek empire or conquest, but it could not tolerate humiliation. The repeated violations of its rights, the loss of its sailors, and the destruction of its commerce pushed the country toward confrontation. By 1812, Americans were beginning to believe that only war could restore their dignity and secure their independence once and for all. The fight that lay ahead would not simply be about ships or trade routes. It would be a struggle for national honor and identity. The first generation of Americans had fought to win their freedom. Now their sons would have to fight to defend it. Impressment, the issue that ignited passions. In the years leading up to 1812, no issue stirred American anger more deeply than the British practice of impressment. It was a violation that touched both pride and freedom, reminding Americans that their independence was still fragile in the face of British power. Impressment meant the forced seizure of sailors from American ships by the British Royal Navy. The practice was centuries old, but it became a crisis when it began targeting citizens of the United States. The British Navy, locked in an endless war against Napoleon's France, needed men. Thousands deserted each year to escape the harsh conditions of naval service. Many of these deserters found work on American merchant vessels, where wages were higher and life was freer. Britain, refusing to recognize that its subjects could become Americans, claimed the right to reclaim them anywhere and at any time. British officers boarded American ships on the high seas, demanding to inspect the crew for supposed deserters. They carried with them no precise lists, no reliable records, and often no proof at all. Any sailor who spoke English could be declared British by birth and dragged away in chains. In many cases, those seized were American-born citizens who had never set foot in Britain. Between 1803 and 1812, over 6,000 sailors from American ships were impressed into British service. The outrage grew with each incident. Newspapers called it kidnapping on the high seas. Congressmen thundered that it was a return to the tyranny of the colonial era. Even the most cautious citizens began to wonder if the revolution's victory had truly secured their rights. The Royal Navy, for its part, justified the practice as a military necessity. Britain was fighting for its life against Napoleon. Its survival, they argued, depended on the strength of its fleet. If a few Americans were mistakenly taken, that was regrettable, but unavoidable in wartime. To British officials, the sovereignty of the United States was secondary to the defense of the British Empire. To Americans, this attitude was intolerable. Impressment struck directly at the heart of national identity. The United States had been founded on the belief that its citizens were free and independent. Now, British warships treated those citizens as property to be seized at will. Every American sailor impressed into British service became a symbol of humiliation, a reminder that Britain still viewed the United States as a rebellious child rather than an equal nation. One incident above all others burned this outrage into public memory. In June 1807, the USS Chesapeake, a new American frigate, sailed from Norfolk, Virginia. Just off the coast, it was intercepted by the British warship HMS Leopard. The British captain demanded the right to search the Chesapeake for alleged deserters. When the American commander refused, the Leopard opened fire. The attack killed and wounded several Americans and forced the Chesapeake to surrender. The British then boarded the crippled ship and dragged away 4 sailors, claiming them as deserters. The Chesapeake Leopard affair sent shockwaves through the United States. It was not merely an insult, it was an act of violence committed within sight of the American coast. The public reaction was explosive. Crowds in port cities burned British flags and effigies of British officers. Newspapers demanded immediate retaliation. "This is war," one editorial declared, "and the nation that will not avenge it is unworthy of freedom." President Jefferson faced enormous pressure to act. Many Americans called for war against Britain, but Jefferson chose a different path. He imposed the Embargo Act of 1807, hoping to use economic pressure instead of arms. Yet the embargo failed to change British behavior. Impressment continued, and so did the anger it fueled. By the time James Madison became president in 1809, the issue had become impossible to ignore. Madison sent repeated protests to London, demanding an end to impressment. British diplomats replied with evasions, insisting that the practice was essential to their war effort. To make matters worse, Britain refused to negotiate seriously unless the United States abandoned its trade with France, a demand no American leader could accept. For ordinary citizens, the debate over impressment was not abstract. It was personal. Families in coastal towns lived with the fear that a father, brother, or son might vanish at sea, taken by British press gangs, and forced to fight for a foreign king. Stories spread of Americans who died under the lash aboard British ships or were never heard from again. Each story hardened public opinion against Britain. Even those who had once supported neutrality began to see impressment as a test of national honor. How could a republic claim to be free if its citizens could be enslaved on the open ocean? How could a nation that had fought for independence allow its people to be dragged into service under a foreign flag? The sense of outrage crossed party lines and regional divisions. Southerners, Westerners, and even many New Englanders came to see impressment as the most visible symbol of British arrogance. By 1811, the anger was reaching a boiling point. Young congressmen from the South and West, soon to be called the Warhawks, rose in the House of Representatives demanding action. They declared that the United States must defend its honor, protect its citizens, and show the world that it would not be bullied. Impressment, they argued, was not simply a maritime issue, but an attack on the very principle of independence. British officials seemed unmoved. Their navy continued to stop American vessels, continued to search their crews, and continued to claim the right to take any man born on British soil. To them, nationality was not a matter of law or citizenship, but of birth and allegiance to the crown. The United States could protest all it wished. Britain intended to rule the seas without interference. By the spring of 1812, the American people had reached their limit. Impressment had become more than a grievance. It was a national humiliation. To tolerate it any longer, many believed, would be to surrender the hard-won dignity of independence. The demand for war was growing, and President Madison could no longer ignore it. The struggle over impressment revealed more than just a conflict between two nations. It exposed the clash between old and new worlds, between monarchy and republic, between the idea that men were subjects of a king and the belief that they were citizens of a free nation. When war finally came, it would not be fought solely for captured sailors, but for the meaning of American citizenship itself. Economic warfare, the stranglehold on American trade. By the turn of the 19th century, the oceans had become battlefields of commerce. Napoleon's France sought to cripple Britain's economy through the continental system, forbidding European nations under French control from trading with Britain. In response, Britain retaliated with its own orders in council, declaring that no ship could trade with the continent unless it first stopped in a British port. Caught between these giants, the United States found itself squeezed by both sides. American ships, proud symbols of free trade and neutral rights, became pawns in an economic war they never sought to join. British cruisers patrolled the Atlantic, halting American vessels and confiscating goods bound for French ports. The Royal Navy demanded that American captains submit their cargoes for inspection. Refusal meant seizure. Meanwhile, Napoleon's decrees branded any ship that obeyed Britain's rules as an enemy of France. To the Americans, neutrality had become a curse. Every voyage was a gamble, every shipment a potential loss. Merchants in New York, Boston, and Baltimore saw their profits vanish as ships were captured or blockaded. Insurance rates soared. Crews refused to sail under the growing threat of impressment and piracy. In Washington, the outrage grew. President Jefferson, seeking to protect American commerce without going to war, chose a bold but controversial path: economic retaliation. In 1807, Congress passed the Embargo Act, halting all exports to Europe. The idea was simple: starve Britain and France of American goods until they respected US neutrality. But the embargo backfired disastrously. Instead of punishing Europe, it crippled the American economy. Ships rotted in port, warehouses overflowed, and unemployment soared along the docks. Farmers could not sell their crops abroad, and merchants cursed the government for their ruin. Smuggling flourished along the Canadian border, and coastal towns defied the law. The British barely noticed. Their empire had colonies around the world to feed their markets. Napoleon scoffed at America's commercial war, calling it naive. The only real victim was the United States itself. By 1809, the experiment in economic coercion had failed. Jefferson left office weary and disillusioned, handing the presidency to James Madison, who inherited the wreckage of American trade. Madison tried to find a middle path, lifting the embargo, but keeping pressure on Britain and France with the Non-Intercourse Act, which banned trade with both powers while reopening commerce elsewhere. Yet even this compromise proved futile. Britain's navy continued to blockade European ports, seizing any ship suspected of aiding France. American merchants still faced confiscation, and sailors still faced the threat of impressment. In London, British leaders viewed the United States as weak and indecisive, a nation unwilling to defend its rights. In Paris, Napoleon used diplomacy to manipulate Madison, pretending to lift his trade restrictions only to deceive the Americans and drive them closer to conflict with Britain. By 1811, the United States stood humiliated on the world stage. American ships dared not sail without fear of seizure. The economy was strangled, exports had plummeted by nearly 80%, and public patience had worn thin. The cries in Congress grew louder. If peace and patience could not preserve American honor, then perhaps war could. And so, amid the wreckage of embargoes and failed diplomacy, the stage was set for a final confrontation. The question was no longer whether America could stay neutral, but whether it could remain free. Frontier fires, the native resistance, and British influence. While the oceans burned with the fire of European conflict, America's western frontier simmered with a different kind of war, one fought in the shadows of forests and along the banks of untamed rivers. In the early 1800s, the United States pushed relentlessly westward, crossing into lands long inhabited by native nations. The treaties signed after the American Revolution had already stripped away enormous territories, but settlers hungered for more. For the fertile valleys of the Ohio country, for the lands beyond the Mississippi, and for dominion over a continent. To the native peoples of the frontier, this was nothing less than invasion. Tribes who once traded peacefully with the Americans now saw their hunting grounds carved into farms, their villages displaced, and their sovereignty ignored. Out of this turmoil emerged two brothers who would change the course of frontier history: Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa, known to settlers as the Prophet. Tecumseh, a brilliant Shawnee leader, dreamed of uniting the tribes of the Great Lakes and the Mississippi Valley into a single confederacy. His brother, a spiritual visionary, preached resistance, urging native peoples to reject American goods, American whiskey, and American lies. Together, they built Prophetstown, a center of native renewal at the confluence of the Wabash and Tippecanoe rivers. But Tecumseh's movement was not just spiritual. It was political and military. He traveled across hundreds of miles, from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico, rallying warriors from dozens of tribes. His message was clear: no single tribe had the right to sell land that belonged to all native nations. The treaties signed by a few chiefs with US officials were, in his eyes, illegitimate and void. In Washington, Tecumseh's Confederacy was seen as a threat to the survival of the young republic's frontier. American settlers in the Indiana Territory demanded protection, accusing the British in Canada of stirring up the tribes with promises, weapons, and gold. And indeed, behind the northern forests, British agents quietly encouraged native resistance. For the British Empire, still smarting from its defeat in the American Revolution, Native alliances were a means to contain US expansion, a living barrier along the border with Canada. Muskets, powder, and supplies flowed through British posts on the Great Lakes, arming warriors who would harass American settlements. By 1811, the situation exploded. While Tecumseh was away recruiting southern tribes, the U.S. governor of Indiana Territory, William Henry Harrison, led a preemptive strike against Prophetstown. The result was the Battle of Tippecanoe, a fierce, chaotic clash fought in the dark. Though both sides suffered losses, Harrison's forces burned Prophetstown to the ground. To American newspapers, Tippecanoe was a triumph, proof that the native uprising had been crushed. But to Tecumseh, it was an act of war. He returned to find his dream of unity in ashes. From that moment on, his confederacy turned decisively toward Britain. In 1812, as tensions between the United States and Britain reached the breaking point over trade and impressment, the frontier ignited. Native warriors, now armed and embittered, struck American outposts and settlements along the Great Lakes. In the minds of many Americans, the two struggles, on sea and on land, had merged into one. They believed the British were orchestrating the violence, manipulating native nations to halt America's destiny. Western congressmen, led by men like Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun, thundered in anger. To them, defeating Britain meant more than defending maritime rights. It meant ending British influence over native peoples once and for all. And so the frontier became another battlefield in the larger war for independence, not from tyranny, but from the lingering shadow of empire. The settlers of the West saw themselves as fighting for survival, while the native nations fought for their very existence. The fires that burned at Tippecanoe were only the beginning. The flames would soon spread across the Great Lakes, into Canada, and deep into the heart of the American Republic. For on the horizon, war was no longer a question of if, but when. The Warhawks and the road to war. By 1811, the patience of the American people had worn thin. For nearly a decade, the nation had endured humiliation. Its sailors seized, its ships confiscated, its frontier attacked, and its commerce strangled by foreign powers. Diplomacy had failed, embargoes had failed, and neutrality, that fragile dream of peace in a world at war, had crumbled under the boots of British arrogance and French deceit. In the halls of Congress, a new generation of leaders rose to power. Men young, ambitious, and unscarred by the Revolution, yet burning with its spirit. They were called the Warhawks. Their names would echo through history. Henry Clay of Kentucky, bold and eloquent. John C. Calhoun of South Carolina, fiery and uncompromising. Felix Grundy of Tennessee, Peter B. Porter of New York, and others who shared their vision. They were the voice of a restless, defiant America, one that would no longer bow to the old world's contempt. To them, Britain was the true enemy. The Royal Navy's impressment of American sailors was not just an insult, but an act of war. The orders in council were economic tyranny, and beyond the Great Lakes, the British were arming native warriors to spill American blood. Henry Clay, newly elected Speaker of the House, rallied Congress to action. He declared that the United States must assert its rights or abandon them forever. His message resonated deeply with Westerners and Southerners who had suffered most from frontier raids and trade restrictions. They saw honor, prosperity, and national survival intertwined. But not all Americans agreed. The older generation, men like John Randolph of Roanoke and the remnants of the Federalist Party, warned that the nation was unprepared. The army was small, the navy tiny, the treasury strained. They argued that war would ruin commerce, invite invasion, and tear the Union apart. Yet the tide of emotion was against them. Newspapers printed stories of American sailors languishing in British service, their names and hometowns recorded as if martyred for the cause of liberty. Western settlers cried out for vengeance against the British agents who armed Tecumseh's warriors. The spirit of 1776 was rekindled, not against kings, but against the empire that had once been America's master. President James Madison, cautious and scholarly, was no natural war leader. He had long hoped diplomacy might restore peace. But by 1812, even Madison could see that the United States was being tested. Britain's navy continued to seize ships without apology. British garrisons in Canada armed and supplied native fighters along the frontier. In April 1812, Congress convened amid a storm of rhetoric and outrage. the Warhawks demanded immediate action. Calhoun declared that submission to Britain's aggression would be a degradation worse than war itself. Across the Atlantic, Britain's government, distracted by Napoleon's armies in Europe, misread America's mood. Just as Congress debated war, London quietly suspended the hated orders in council. But the news crossed the ocean too late. The momentum for war in Washington was unstoppable. On June 1, 1812, President Madison sent his war message to Congress, the first in the nation's history. It was a somber, methodical case built on years of grievances, impressment, trade restrictions, frontier bloodshed, and insults to national honor. Madison wrote that the United States had borne with patience but could endure no more. The House of Representatives voted for war 79 to 49. The Senate followed 19 to 13. The divisions were sharp. New England stood largely opposed, while the South and West roared in favor. On June 18, 1812, Madison signed the Declaration. The United States of America was officially at war with Great Britain. The War of 1812 had begun, but it was not the kind of war many Americans imagined. The nation's army was small, its officers inexperienced, its navy outnumbered 10 to 1. Many citizens, especially in New England, opposed the conflict outright. Britain, though preoccupied with Napoleon, still possessed the greatest military machine on earth. Yet the Warhawks believed that the Republic's courage and righteousness would prevail. They dreamed of quick victories, perhaps even the conquest of Canada, and of proving once and for all that the United States was not a fragile experiment but a rising power worthy of respect. The stage was set for a struggle that would test the young nation's will, unity, and endurance. A war fought on land and sea, in forests and on the Great Lakes, from the burning of Washington to the birth of a new national identity. A war that began not only over impressment or trade, but over what it truly meant to be independent. America at war. The invasion of Canada. When war came in 1812, many Americans believed victory would be swift and glorious. The United States was a young nation brimming with confidence, convinced that liberty and destiny would triumph over tyranny and empire. The Warhawks in Congress had promised an easy conquest, that Canada, sparsely defended and filled with discontented settlers, would fall in a single campaign. But war rarely follows the plans of politicians. The invasion of Canada would test America's strength, its leadership, and its illusions. The United States entered the war with barely 7,000 regular soldiers, scattered across distant forts from Maine to the Mississippi. The rest were state militias, poorly trained and often unwilling to fight outside their home territories. The army lacked supplies, discipline, and experienced commanders. Yet in the summer of 1812, the government ordered a three-pronged assault into British Canada, from Detroit, from Niagara, and from Lake Champlain. The first blow would fall from the northwest, led by General William Hull, governor of Michigan Territory. A veteran of the Revolution, Hull was cautious and aging. Still, he crossed into Upper Canada in July 1812, proclaiming to the inhabitants that they would be liberated from British tyranny. He expected local Canadians to welcome the Americans as friends. Instead, they rallied to defend their homes. Across the Detroit River, a formidable opponent waited. Major General Isaac Brock, the energetic commander of British forces in Canada. Brock understood the stakes. If Canada fell, the British Empire would lose its foothold in North America. He also had an invaluable ally, Tecumseh, the great Shawnee leader whose warriors fought fiercely to defend their homeland and resist American expansion. Together, Brock and Tecumseh formed a powerful partnership. While Hull hesitated and his supply lines faltered, the British and native forces moved swiftly. In August, they captured Fort Mackinac in the north, cutting off Hull's communication with the frontier. Rumors spread of massive native forces ready to strike Detroit. Panic gripped the American camp. Then came Brock's bold deception. He surrounded Detroit with a smaller force, but made it appear far larger, parading his troops and native allies through the woods to intimidate the Americans. Facing what he believed to be overwhelming odds and fearing a massacre, General Hull surrendered Detroit on August 16, 1812, without firing a shot. It was a disaster. An entire American army, more than 2,000 men, marched into British captivity. The surrender stunned the nation. Newspapers denounced Hull as a coward. He was later court-martialed and sentenced to death, though President Madison commuted the sentence out of pity. The defeat destroyed American morale and emboldened Britain and its native allies. Meanwhile, the other invasions fared no better. Along the Niagara frontier, General Stephen Van Rensselaer led poorly trained militia across the river at Queenston Heights in October 1812. The attack was brave but chaotic. Many of the militia refused to cross into foreign territory, claiming they were not obligated to fight outside the United States. The assault collapsed. Brock was killed in the battle, but the British held their ground. In the north, along Lake Champlain, another attempt under General Henry Dearborn sputtered out in confusion and retreat. By winter, the entire campaign had failed. The Americans had invaded Canada expecting an easy conquest. Instead, they found a united enemy and a harsh awakening. But amid the defeats, the war began to forge new leaders and lessons. The army reorganized, new officers rose through the ranks, and the government realized the need for discipline and preparation. Congress expanded the regular army, and new young commanders began to emerge with experience and determination. While the northern campaign stalled, American forces found success at sea. The U.S. Navy, though small, astonished the world with a series of stunning victories. Single-ship duels that restored national pride and proved that American sailors could match the might of Britain. But on land, the path ahead remained steep and uncertain. The invasion of Canada had revealed the nation's weaknesses: disorganization, divided loyalties, and overconfidence. Yet it also hardened its resolve. Americans now understood that this war would not be won by declarations or speeches, but by courage and endurance. The humiliation at Detroit and Queenston Heights became a rallying cry. The frontier burned with vengeance. The call went out to rebuild, to strike back, and to redeem the nation's honor. As 1813 dawned, a new phase of the war began, one that would see blood spilled on the Great Lakes, victories won and lost in the wilderness, and the young republic tested as never before. For America, the war had truly begun. War on the Great Lakes, the battle for control of the North. After the disastrous invasion of Canada in 1812, America's hopes turned to the vast inland seas, the Great Lakes. Whoever controlled these waters would control the war in the north. The lakes were the highways of the frontier, carrying troops, supplies, and communication between distant forts. Without naval dominance, no army could advance far into enemy territory. At the start of the war, the British held the advantage. Their navy on the Great Lakes, supported from Canada, was better equipped and more experienced. American forces, scattered and undersupplied, faced a daunting task: to build a navy from scratch in the wilderness. In the winter of 1812 to 1813, work began along the shores of Lake Erie, at a small frontier outpost called Presque Isle, now modern-day Erie, Pennsylvania. There, a young and determined officer named Oliver Hazard Perry took command. Only 27 years old, Perry was relentless in his purpose. His orders were simple: build a fleet, find the enemy, and fight for control of the lake. Through snow, mud, and shortages, Perry and his men labored day and night. Timber was cut from nearby forests. Guns were hauled overland through swamps, and shipwrights worked by torchlight. In just a few months, Perry had assembled a squadron of 9 vessels, small brigs and schooners, but enough to challenge British command of Lake Erie. Meanwhile, the British under Captain Robert Barclay prepared their own fleet at Amherstburg. Supplies were scarce, and reinforcements slow to arrive from across the Atlantic. Both sides knew the coming battle would decide the fate of the Northwest. On the morning of September 10, 1813, the two fleets sighted each other near Put-in Bay. The wind was light, the lake calm. Perry, aboard his flagship USS Lawrence, hoisted a battle flag bearing the immortal words of his fallen comrade, Captain James Lawrence. "Don't give up the ship." The engagement began with thunder. Cannon fire roared across the lake as the two lines closed. The British guns, heavier and longer ranged, tore into the Lawrence. For 2 brutal hours, Perry's flagship was reduced to a shattered wreck. Nearly every man aboard was dead or wounded, but Perry refused to surrender. In an act of daring, he seized his battle flag, climbed into a small boat, and rowed through gunfire to his second ship, the USS Niagara. There, he reformed his line, bore down upon the British, and unleashed a devastating broadside at point-blank range. Within minutes, the British line collapsed. By mid-afternoon, the battle was over. Perry had achieved one of the greatest naval victories in American history. His dispatch to General William Henry Harrison was short and unforgettable. "We have met the enemy, and they are ours." The victory at Lake Erie changed everything. The British lost control of the northwest frontier. Their supply lines to Detroit were severed, forcing them to abandon the region. American troops, led by Harrison, quickly advanced and recaptured Detroit, avenging the humiliation of the year before. Pursuing the retreating British and native forces into Canada, Harrison met them again at the Battle of the Thames in October 1813. There, the combined British and native army was routed, and Tecumseh, the great Shawnee leader, was killed in battle. His death shattered the native confederacy that had fought alongside Britain. The dream of a united native resistance in the Old Northwest died with him. The war in the North was far from over, but the momentum had shifted. For the first time, Americans could claim clear victory on land and sea. The triumphs at Lake Erie and the Thames restored national confidence and pride. They proved that despite early defeats, the Republic could rise, adapt, and prevail. Across the frontier, news of Perry's victory spread like wildfire. Newspapers hailed him as a hero, the savior of the Northwest. His triumph was not only military but symbolic, a declaration that America could challenge the world's mightiest navy and win. The Great Lakes Campaign also revealed the growing skill and determination of the young nation's forces. Shipbuilders, sailors, and soldiers had achieved what seemed impossible, building a navy in the wilderness and using it to turn the tide of war. Yet the conflict was far from decided. Even as the northwestern frontier was secured, the British turned their attention to other fronts. Along the Niagara frontier, brutal fighting raged throughout 1813 and 1814. On the Atlantic coast, the Royal Navy tightened its blockade, strangling American trade and preparing for new invasions. The War of 1812 had entered its second, bloodier phase. The victory on Lake Erie was a beacon of hope, but the storm had only just begun. The world's greatest empire was gathering its strength for a counterblow that would strike at the very heart of the young republic. Burning the capital, the British invasion of 1814. The year 1814 brought one of the darkest moments in American history. The tide of war had turned. Napoleon had fallen in Europe, freeing Britain's armies and fleets to finally crush the upstart republic across the Atlantic. With Europe at peace, Britain could now focus its wrath on the United States. The British war strategy shifted from defense to punishment. No longer restrained by commitments abroad, they launched a three-pronged assault into New York from Canada, along the Gulf Coast toward New Orleans, and up the Chesapeake Bay, the very heart of the young American Republic. The Chesapeake Campaign would become infamous. British forces, hardened from years of war against Napoleon, sailed up the bay in the summer of 1814 with orders to strike fear into the Americans. Rear Admiral George Cockburn and Major General Robert Ross led a powerful expeditionary force, determined to retaliate for American attacks on York and other Canadian towns. The Americans were unprepared. Washington, D.C., though the nation's capital, was poorly defended. A small city of fewer than 10,000 people, with limited fortifications and few soldiers nearby. Secretary of War John Armstrong dismissed warnings that the British would attack the capital, insisting their real target must be Baltimore. But the British were coming for Washington. In August 1814, they landed at Benedict, Maryland, and marched inland through the humid summer heat. Facing them at Bladensburg was a disorganized American force of militia and regulars under General William Winder. President James Madison himself rode out to the battlefield to observe, a rare and desperate act for a sitting president. The battle was a disaster. The British veterans, disciplined and relentless, easily broke through the American lines. The militia fled in panic, many throwing down their weapons as they ran. British troops pressed forward, routing the defenders in what would be called the Bladensburg races. Washington lay undefended. That night, the Redcoats entered the capital. Admiral Cockburn led the way, reportedly mocking Congress as he entered the abandoned halls of government. The British set fire to public buildings, the Capitol, the Treasury, the Navy Yard, and finally the President's mansion. Flames devoured the city. The glow could be seen for miles in every direction as the seat of the American government burned. Dolly Madison, before fleeing the White House, saved Gilbert Stuart's portrait of George Washington. a symbol of the nation's endurance amid humiliation. The burning of Washington shocked the world. For the British, it was revenge for York, but for Americans, it was a national disgrace. Proof of unpreparedness and division. The government fled to safety, and the capital lay in ruins. Yet even in the ashes, the American spirit refused to die. Only weeks later, the British turned their sights on Baltimore, expecting another easy victory. But there, the citizens and soldiers of the United States would stand firm. The flames of Washington became a turning point. What had begun as a war of pride and politics was now a fight for survival, identity, and respect on the world stage. Out of the burning capital rose a new determination to prove that the United States, though battered and humbled, would not be destroyed. The invasion of 1814 showed America's vulnerability, but also its resilience. From the ashes of Washington, a new fire of defiance burned, and it would blaze brightest at Fort McHenry, where the flag itself became a symbol of endurance against the storm.